The Shroud of Turin is one of the greatest mysteries in our history, as it may be the closest thing we have to the existence of Jesus.
For centuries, the most common image of Jesus Christ, at least in Western cultures, has been that of a bearded, fair-skinned man with long, wavy, light brown or blonde hair and often blue eyes. But the Bible doesn't describe Jesus physically, and all the evidence we do have indicates he probably looked very different from how he has long been portrayed. Recently, a new discovery by scientists about the Shroud of Turin has astonished the world as it described Jesus Christ. Not only that, the shroud has been proven to be much older than the experts have claimed it to be. The cloth itself matches artifacts that date to the time of Christ in the Middle East. But what makes the Shroud of Turin so controversial? Here's where things start to get really shocking. Carbon dating of the Shroud of Turin. It was in 1988, an international team of scientific experts performed radiocarbon dating on snippets of the Shroud of Turin. The results showed that the famous cloth did not date back to the time of Christ's crucifixion in the 1st century AD. In fact, the cloth seemed to have been manufactured sometime between 1260 and 1390 AD. The team concluded the shroud was nothing more than a medieval hoax. In the years since the stunning announcement, shroud experts and other investigators have called into question the accuracy of the dating. Some have even argued that damage to the border of the shroud in December 1532 during a fire in the chapel of the Dukes of Savoy in Chambéry, France, might in some way have changed the chemical composition of the cloth and skewed the testing results. Stephen J. Mattingly, a professor of microbiology and immunology at the University of Texas Health Sciences Center in San Antonio, also doubts the 1988 radiocarbon results, though he blames not fire, but microbes. Despite the lingering controversy, the basic science behind radiocarbon dating is disarmingly straightforward. The element carbon exists naturally on Earth in two stable forms, or isotopes, known as carbon-12 and carbon-13. In carbon-13, the nucleus of the atom contains one extra subatomic particle called a neutron. A third isotope of carbon with two extra neutrons, known as carbon-14, is produced in the atmosphere when atoms of nitrogen are blasted by high-energy cosmic rays streaming in from space. The atom is unstable, radioactive, and eventually decays back into nitrogen-14. Because some of the radioactive atom always exists at a low level in the atmosphere and on Earth. However, it gets incorporated at a predictable rate into the cells and tissues of all living things, from bacteria to plants to people. When, for example, the organisms suck up C14, containing carbon dioxide molecules as part of their natural metabolic processes. After things die, they no longer take in C14. And so, as the isotope decays back to nitrogen-14, its relative abundance steadily decreases over time. Measuring the amount of C14 in something originally derived from organic material, then a wooden artifact, say, or the fibers of a linen cloth, which are made from flax plants, tells the amount of time that has passed since the organism it came from was last alive. What that means, however, is that any contamination with an object that was more recently alive will raise the relative abundance of C14 atoms, producing an apparently younger age. In the case of the Shroud of Turin, the younger contaminants were bacteria. You might imagine that over hundreds of years or several thousand, the shroud has come in contact with many thousands of species of bacteria and fungi, and some were able to grow for short or long periods of time. Some of these organisms would be more recent and be incorporating more recent radiocarbon material. The microbes are not digesting the linen, they are eating one another, so to speak. As long as they can grow and incorporate carbon dioxide, which many microbes can do, they are actually making the shroud appear more recent as time continues. In fact, scientists have found several different species of bacteria colonizing pieces of the shroud, including some organisms that had never been seen before. They tested samples from an outside strip of the cloth removed during the 1988 dating effort. the scientific caretaker of the shroud at the time, kept the strip and later provided samples to scientists. One said, "The Catholic Church did not sanction the removal and giving of the material to us and would not certify that the pieces were authentic. Nevertheless, we know that they are authentic." Intriguingly, one of the microbe species seems to be producing an unusual material that coats the linen threads with a brittle plastic-like material that made the linen difficult to cut, much like trying to cut through dry pasta. It appears that this polymer may have actually helped preserve the shroud linen through time. Similar coatings on other artifacts, the linen wrappings on mummies, for example, could also be affecting their radiocarbon ages. Some also suspect that bacteria are responsible for the shroud's ethereal image. The idea is that as the crucified man was dying, bacteria such as the common skin microbe Staphylococcus epidermi would have colonized and multiplied in his bloody wounds, creating a thin layer called a biofilm. A biofilm can soak up water like a sponge. After the man died and his body was washed, the biofilm would have absorbed water and become extremely sticky. When the burial shroud was later placed over the body, it would have adhered fast, allowing the transfer of the microbes to the fibers of the cloth. Over time, the degradation of the microbes would have produced a faint yellow imprint of the face and body that slowly darkened. They have observed the drying of bacteria on surfaces before and noticed that they leave a straw yellow color similar to that observed with the Turin shroud. Key to the color change are unsaturated fatty acids, normally found within the membranes of all types of cells, including bacteria. The addition of oxygen atoms to the fatty acids molecules, or oxidation, changes their chemical makeup, giving rise to the yellow color. Similarly, the yellowing seen in Ring Around the Collar is due to fatty acids from the body and bacteria that have rubbed off onto the collar. The only physical description of Jesus. The only physical description of Jesus that does exist is from a copy of a letter from the Roman consul Lentulus to the Roman Emperor Tiberius, discovered in a monastery with copies of other ancient documents. According to the copy, the original letter dated to the 12th year of the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. We have historical verification that a Roman consul named Lentulus was in Judea at the time of Jesus' trial and crucifixion. His influential family is mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus in his book Antiquities of the Jews. However, some scholars wonder as to the authenticity of the letter. Lentulus's letter was an official report to Emperor Tiberius. He describes Jesus as having a noble and lively face with fair and slightly wavy hair, black and strongly curving eyebrows, intense penetrating blue eyes, and an expression of wondrous grace. His nose is rather long. His beard is almost blonde, although not very long. His hair is quite long and has never seen a pair of scissors. His neck is slightly inclined, so that he never appears to be bitter or arrogant. His tanned face is the color of ripe corn and well-proportioned. It gives the impression of gravity and wisdom, sweetness and good, and is completely lacking in any sign of anger. We can take the description from Lentulus's letter and add it to the information gathered from the figure of the Shroud of Turin to complete the physical description of Christ. Professor Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, a Shroud of Turin scholar, took the data collected from the shroud and interpreted the information using his experience as a doctor and university professor of forensic medicine. He wrote, "The man who was wrapped in the shroud was a man of great beauty and uncommon stature. He was about 1 meter and 80 centimeters, about 6 feet tall, with a perfectly proportioned physique, lithe and harmonious. He was a standard type in the most literal sense of the phrase. Although the cloth has suffered much damage, we can see that his face was a very soft and gentle one, rather long and with a broad, straight forehead. The nose is straight and turned slightly downwards. The cheeks are large and slightly protruding. From all the anthropometric calculations so far made, it seems that Christ was physically in far better shape than the average man. Through a complicated process of elaborating his facial data, I can conclude that his cranial capacity was of 1575 cc, which would place him in the megalocephalic, large-headed category, with a cranial capacity coefficient of 95, which would indicate that the weight of his brain was 1492 grams. This is far greater than average, suggesting a person of extraordinary genius. Is the shroud originated in the Middle East? New scientific studies revealed that the flax used to make the linen on the shroud was grown and developed in the Middle East. Studies show that the flax originated in the Western Levant, an area shared by Israel, Lebanon, and the western parts of Jordan and Syria. The new study shows that the shroud was at one time in the Middle East and was not a European creation. The study also found that the coins placed on the eyes of the crucified man matched a similar practice documented by a 2nd century burial source in Judea. Adding to the study, the wounds from the crown of thorns are in a helmet style that matches a featured characteristic of punishment in Asia Minor and the Levant, rather than in Rome and Europe. The shroud holds all the earmarks of a Middle Eastern artifact, rather than one from medieval Europe, as some have suggested. The carbon-14 dating has now been largely discredited by the majority of researchers studying the shroud. This includes 4 research papers, written by 12 experts, and published in peer-reviewed academic journals, all of whom agree that the carbon-14 dating was flawed. New non-destructive dating tests, which appear to be more accurate and less likely prone to contamination, have now conducted experiments on the shroud. The test used for the shroud was the wide-angle X-ray scattering test. It uses wide-angled X-ray experiments to determine the chemical composition and phase of decay of polymer samples. The test examines the polymer samples and can accurately gauge when the fibers were created. The wide-angle X-ray scattering test confirmed that the Shroud of Turin was made in the 1st century and contains extremely rare soil found in Jerusalem, along with deposits of pollen from plants exclusively found in the Jerusalem region. But something is so weird. The researchers who tested the shroud with the wide-angle X-ray scattering test also discovered something very bizarre. What they found was also deduced by previous researchers from the National Agency for New Technologies and the Energy and Sustainable Economic Development Agency, both from Italy. What was bizarre is that the blood marks should have stuck to the body and smeared when the body was removed. Yet that did not happen with the Turin shroud. Further studies suggest that the body dematerialized in the shroud, causing the shroud to collapse on itself. Engineering researchers from the National Agency for New Technologies and the Energy and Sustainable Economic Development successfully produced an image on a cloth similar to the Turin shroud, but on a much smaller scale. Oddly, the team produced the image by X-ray radiation with a laser. Team members determined that vacuum ultraviolet photons account for the thin coloration depth, the hue of color, and the presence of the image even in areas that were not in direct contact with the body. In layman's terms, a brilliant display of light emerged from within the body, leading to the body's dematerialization and the shroud's collapse upon itself. A researcher assesses that the shroud's image would take several billion watts of light radiation, which exceeds the maximum output of any energy source of UV radiation known today. If that accompanying heat energy had been present, the cloth would have vaporized in less than 1/40 billionth of a second. One estimate is that it took around 4 to 8 billion watts of UV light radiation to produce the image on the shroud. Some researchers suggest that the level of radiation may have been much higher. They hold that the more likely level was at 34 trillion watts of ultraviolet light radiation. So, what can we take from these findings? It appears that more and more research suggests that the Turin shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. The cloth is placed in the 1st century, the time when Jesus lived, and in the Middle East, where Jesus lived. The image on the cloth matches the depictions of how Jesus was crucified, matching the gospel narratives. Additionally, the image was produced in some otherworldly manner. The process involved UV light radiation, but without a heat source which would have destroyed the cloth. Accompanying this oddity, the process also included the dematerialization of the body within the cloth, all aspects matching characteristics associated with Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. While the believer's faith is not dependent on the Turin shroud's authenticity, the shroud, if legitimate, can give a believer insight into the working nature of the resurrection. Also, if the Turin shroud is authentic, as the evidence suggests, it gives a believer some insight as to what to expect when we experience our own resurrection event. As an early New Testament creed states, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the archangel's voice, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we, who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore encouraged one another with these words. Even so, come Lord Jesus with your divine light and power." The matter of patterns is most relevant to a discussion of the shroud. Patterns of evidence discovered and undeniably present within the shroud weigh heavily in favor of the claim that it is Jesus' burial cloth. Researchers have discovered many individual patterns of evidence within the shroud itself, and these form a larger pattern when taken together. The Shroud of Turin is made of fine linen, woven in a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern. The direction of the twist of the strands rules out Egypt as the country of origin and affirms Palestine. The shroud's length and width are in even cubits, a unit of measurement not used in medieval Europe, where critics say the shroud was faked, but in ancient Israel. The unusual weave reflects a wealthy owner. In 2002, conservation measures were taken secretly for the shroud in Italy. With the 16th century backing cloth removed from the shroud for the first time, textile expert Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg discovered a rare type of stitch on the backside of the shroud, which was known from only one other place, the Masada fortress in Israel, which fell to the Romans in the Jewish revolt, less than a generation from Jesus' time. The image on the shroud of a man crucified is its greatest mystery. To this day, after exhaustive scientific study and numerous attempts to duplicate the figure of the man shown on it, no one has been able to do this at the microscopic level of the linen fibers. The image is on the outermost layers of those fibers as discolorations. They are microscopic pixels. The image is not painted, despite the continued claims of people who simply repeat this explanation over and against the verdict of the experts from the Shroud of Turin research project and others before and since. The only traces of paint are from duplicates of the shroud that were pressed against the shroud to sanctify the duplicates in earlier centuries. These are tiny flakes of paint. The linen fibers themselves show no trace of brush strokes, binder, or pigment. Nothing has soaked in, nothing is present to soak in. Only in very recent times have scientists found a way to discolor linen strands as they are found in the Shroud of Turin, discolorations penetrating only to a tiny fraction of the width of a human hair. It was done with microbursts from high-energy lasers, a burst of high energy. This carries suggestions of its own about the man of the shroud because if it is Jesus, he is proclaimed to be raised from the dead. Is the shroud a snapshot of the resurrection? Anyone who has seen the actual shroud or a full-size, high-detail reproduction of it knows that the image of the crucified man is a negative rather than a positive image. How or why an alleged forger did that has no answers. But to recognize the image, one must be 6 or 8 feet back from the shroud. Any closer, and the image on the cloth is lost. This fact further argues against a forger. How could such an image be created by someone working up close? Wounds appear on the image which science has established to have been present on the cloth prior to the presence of the body image itself, and the blood has been shown to be actual human blood, type AB. Normally, blood becomes brown as it ages. The blood of the shroud is red, which seems impossible if it is 2,000 years old. This has been advanced as evidence of fakery, but blood chemists know of changes in the blood of persons under great stress or suffering, like a crucifixion victim. Bilirubin is a pigment that enters the blood with the breakdown of red cells. It causes blood to hold a red color. Did a forger use actual human blood and torture his donor so the blood would remain red for centuries, then paint the blood on the linen cloth before there was an image, all in order to fool people centuries later? Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. No one knows what the truth is. When soil traces from the foot region of the shroud were analyzed for their composition with a scanning ion microprobe at Chicago's Enrico Fermi Institute, the graph of the results almost completely matched the graph read out for the aragonite soil of Jerusalem. This was literally pattern matching pattern. Pollen grains adhering to tape samples pressed against the shroud indicated that the shroud had been present in the Jerusalem area, then northern Syria, Anatolia, Constantinople, and Europe. This matched the pattern of travel hypothesized by shroud students, based on ancient references to an Edessa cloth which found its way to Constantinople, and then, as a result of the Fourth Crusade, came to France. If the shroud were just a fake, the presence of all the non-European pollens is inexplicable. An Israeli botanist, Dr. Avinoam Danin of Hebrew University, Jerusalem, asserted that he had found patterns of flowers on the cloth, flowers that bloom in Jerusalem in the spring. Professor Danin had no religious motivation to authenticate the shroud. The greatest message of the Shroud of Turin. The Holy Shroud of Turin is primarily given to a relic now preserved at Turin, for which the claim is made that it is the actual clean linen cloth in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. This relic, though blackened by age, bears the faint but distinct impress of a human form, both back and front. If the marks we perceive were caused by human body, it is clear that the body, supine, was laid lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half was doubled back over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from the face to the feet. The shroud was brought into Turin, Italy, in 1578, and has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1694. The shroud goes on exhibition only a few times a century, and when it does, millions of people slowly file past it to see the front and back images of the crucified man. The shroud is woven from linen thread made from the stems of the flax plant. In making linen thread, flax fibers are separated from the rest of the stem by allowing the stems to rot in water. The diameter of these fibers is about 15 to 20 which is about a fifth of the diameter of a human hair. A typical linen thread contains about 100 of these fibers. Luke and the other three Gospels include this account of Jesus' burial after his crucifixion. On the morning of Jesus' resurrection, Luke records that Peter saw the strips of linen by themselves, whereas the Gospel of John states that Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This separate cloth has generated passionate interest today because many people think it might be the Shroud of Turin, believed to be Jesus' burial cloth. If true, the shroud would provide compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity. But is it really Jesus' burial cloth? What we know and what we don't know. The answer to that question relies on historical, scientific, and biblical data, as well as input from many other disciplines. Often, the actual data and the popular conception don't line up well and make it difficult to understand the complex issues surrounding the shroud. It seems indisputable that the shroud came from someone who was crucified. Further, the image and stains on the shroud validate the Bible's description of crucifixion. As physical evidence of that restoration, the shroud presents a mirror of the gospel, which is sacrificial love beyond all fathoming. Everything depends on it and is downstream from it. Everything else is scaffolded on this revelation. Jesus told us, "Take up your cross each day and follow me," meaning that his cross and passion are inextricably woven into the life of his followers. The Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, is the source and summit of Christian life. If you look at the Gospels themselves, they are passion narratives with long introductions. Pope Benedict XVI stated, "Don't be afraid of the cross. It's the source of every blessing." The wounded Christ, clearly depicted on the shroud, invites the faithful to claim his wounds, as well as their own, as a conduit of grace. They are precisely where his grace flows into us. Jesus, upon his death on the cross, descended into the world, filling it with light and hope. When light shines in darkness, the darkness is dispelled. So it is when Christ freely lays down his life and takes it back up. He's showing himself as being utterly of a higher order, Dr. Dalton pointed out. In truth, God has already definitively won the battle. The only question is, are we remaining in Christ? Christ, the head, is already seated in glory. If we're members of his body, if we remain with him, we are co-heirs. Regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the documents. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and others. And we have monuments, namely, archaeological objects such as the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, the latter being the cloth that covered Jesus' face while he was taken down from the cross. These objects are consistent with scriptural accounts of Jesus' passion and death. Not only are they compatible with the biblical narrative, but they're mutually illuminating. The artifact on one hand and the narrative on the other hand, both shedding light on each other. Every attempt to reproduce the shroud by any naturalistic means has failed. People can't do it in a lab, especially not at the micro level. Every detail, from the shape of the body and the ratios of one limb to the other, to the blood flows, to the folding of the thumbs from damage to the nerves in the hands, is captured with medical precision. In-depth studies of the shroud in the 1970s ruled out the presence of varnish, pigments, brush strokes, directionality, or any trace whatsoever of human artwork. Nor was the image produced by heat or by any type of photography, which wasn't invented until the 19th century. There are multiple hypotheses for how the shroud came into being, but none can be scientifically proven. That's where Christians need to step up and say, what if it was not created by naturalistic means? What if it's the natural result of a supernatural occurrence? The message of the Shroud of Turin is the same as that of the gospel narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. God's unfathomable love. Jesus shows divine love in ways that we simply cannot doubt. It is in deed and in truth that he loves us. And when you look at the cross, when you're looking at his image in the shroud, you're seeing him say, "I love you." You must know this. Every detail in the biblical narratives of the Passion reveals some aspect of that love. It would be too easy to glance over the details of the Passion, but the shroud forces you to pause on it. The cross was the means by which Jesus, who had emptied himself of glory in becoming human, returned to his glorified state at the right hand of the Father. In order to follow Christ, people must take up their own crosses in the form of the trials they face each day. Jesus tells us, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So, can we expect any other pathway than the one he showed us? Learning about and venerating the shroud inevitably leads to a deeper understanding of the mission Jesus came to fulfill. Beholding and contemplating the image of Christ causes transformation to come within us. In that way, the shroud is just the doorbell. It says, "Come in." The shroud offers an astounding opportunity, and a credible means of sharing the gospel with people who do not yet believe. Our faith is not about fairy tales or fables, but an event in history that actually took place. We celebrate the incarnation, that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. From that place, he's reborn into glory. That's a picture of what we all must also do. We die with him in order to rise with him. Because of its holy meaning, you may wonder how to visit the Turin Shroud. If you're traveling to Turin or the surrounding areas, you must visit the Turin Cathedral, where the Holy Shroud is kept. But bear in mind, the original cloth is not on public display. The shroud is in such a fragile state that it isn't put on display for the general public. It is guarded by bulletproof glass and security cameras. You can visit the chapel where it's safely kept, and you will see a replica of the shroud. The good news is that you might be able to see the real shroud in all its glory if you travel to Turin in 2025. The Pope announced that the Shroud of Turin might be displayed to the public in 2025, coinciding with the Jubilee year. Specific dates are not confirmed yet, but the Vatican will announce them soon. Hopefully. The rare display of the Turin Shroud already happened in 2000, 2010, and 2015. If it happens in 2025, or maybe 2026, it will be a big event for the Christian community and Turin. So if you plan to visit the city, you better plan it as soon as the Vatican announces the dates. If you can't make it to the 2025 Holy Shroud public display, and if only admiring the Shroud Chapel is not enough for you, there is a place where you can get more info and be a bit closer to it. The Most Holy Shroud Museum, in Italian, Il Museo della Sindone, is where you need to go. At the museum, you can learn details about the shroud's fascinating history and its many mysteries, replicas, and incredible displays of the artifact.